the Christmas Truce of 1914. On Christmas Eve, 1914, a British soldier lying in a freezing trench in Belgium looked up and saw lights appearing along the German line opposite him. Dozens of them, then hundreds, small and flickering, strung along the enemy trench for as far as he could see. His first thought was that it was some kind of trick. It was not a trick. It was Christmas trees. The German soldiers, barely 100 meters away, were decorating their trenches with candles and singing carols into the night air. And what happened over the next 48 hours became one of the strangest events in the history of warfare. A moment when tens of thousands of men on both sides simply stopped fighting, walked into the deadliest strip of land in Europe, and shook hands with the enemy. To understand how strange this actually was, you need to understand what the trenches were like by December 1914. The war was only 5 months old, and already it had turned into something nobody had planned for. Both sides had expected a war of movement, quick advances, decisive battles, home by Christmas. Instead, the armies had fought each other to a standstill along a line of trenches stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Men lived in mud and freezing water, within sight of an enemy they rarely saw except as a muzzle flash. No man's land between the trenches was a strip of churned earth littered with unburied dead, sometimes as narrow as 50 meters, close enough to hear the other side coughing. This was not a place where trust could survive. And yet, in the days before Christmas, something had already started shifting. Along parts of the line, an unofficial, unspoken understanding had quietly taken hold. Soldiers on both sides, exhausted and freezing, had started easing off. Snipers who could have taken a kill let it pass. Shelling grew lighter at certain times of day, almost as if by agreement, though no order had ever been given. Historians call this live and let live, and it had been happening in patches for weeks, small pockets of restraint that officers on both sides generally disapproved of. Christmas simply pushed it into the open. On the 24th of December, soldiers along the German line began singing. Stille Nacht drifted across no man's land, and on the British side, men who did not speak a word of German recognized the tune immediately. Silent Night. Some began singing it back in English. Verse answered verse across a stretch of ground where that same morning men had been trying to kill each other. Then came shouted messages, not gunfire, words. Merry Christmas, Tommy. You know shoot, we know shoot. In some sections, soldiers called out invitations to meet in the middle. And here is where it gets almost impossible to believe if you didn't have the letters home to prove it. Men started climbing out of the trenches, unarmed, into the open ground where hours earlier, doing exactly that would have meant near certain death. They met in the middle of no man's land. They shook hands, exchanged names they could barely pronounce, swapped what they had, cigarettes, buttons from their uniforms, tins of food, in some places actual alcohol. A German soldier gave a British soldier a fur cap in exchange for a tin of beef. Men who had spent months trying to kill one another were suddenly standing shoulder to shoulder, comparing photographs of their families back home. Along parts of the line, they used the truce for something more somber. Both sides had dead lying in no man's land who had been impossible to retrieve, sometimes for weeks. On Christmas Day, soldiers from opposing armies worked together to bury the fallen, sometimes holding a joint funeral service, reading psalms in 2 languages over men who had been enemies the day before. And then there was football. This is the detail that has outlived almost everything else about the truce, repeated so often it's practically legend, and the strange thing is that the core of it is true. In multiple places along the line, soldiers cleared patches of frozen ground and kicked a ball around, British against German, using their caps or empty ration tins as goalposts where a real ball wasn't available. There is no definitive record of one single organized match with an agreed final score. What there is instead is dozens of separate, smaller games breaking out independently up and down the line, groups of freezing young men who, 12 hours earlier, had been trying to end each other's lives, now arguing over an offside call. Estimates of how many men were involved vary, but historians generally agree the truce touched somewhere around 100,000 soldiers, spread across roughly 2/3 of the British-held sections of the front. It was not universal. In some sectors, officers refused to allow it, and the war continued exactly as brutally as it had the day before, sometimes only a few hundred meters from where men were singing carols together. Which brings us to the part of this story that command structures on both sides found genuinely alarming, because what had just happened was, from a military standpoint, a serious problem. Not because anyone had been hurt, because the entire logic of the war depended on ordinary soldiers seeing the men across no man's land as an enemy to be destroyed, not as another exhausted young man a very long way from home who also missed Christmas. Senior commanders on both sides were horrified when word reached them. Orders went out, in some cases within days, explicitly forbidding any further fraternization, with soldiers told that repeating the truce would bring serious disciplinary action. Artillery units in several sectors were ordered to shell the enemy line on Boxing Day specifically to force both sides back into a state of hostility, breaking the mood before it could take root. It worked, in the sense that nothing on this scale ever happened again. There were smaller, quieter, more local truces in isolated pockets in the years that followed, but by Christmas 1915, artillery bombardments were deliberately scheduled to make any repeat impossible. And the war had grown so much larger and so much more brutal that the conditions which had allowed it, small numbers of exhausted men close enough to talk, mostly evaporated. Because here's what has to sit alongside the warmth of this story. Many of the very same men who shook hands and traded cigarettes in no man's land on Christmas Day were, within days, back to shelling and shooting at those exact same soldiers. War correspondents from the period include soldiers writing home in genuine anguish about this, describing the strange horror of exchanging gifts with a man on Christmas morning and then being ordered to try to kill him again by New Year. One British officer wrote that it had been the most extraordinary Christmas of his life, and then, in the very same letter, described resuming fire on the same German position days later. The war ground on for almost 4 more years after that. Some of the men who shook hands in no man's land in 1914 did not survive to see the armistice. So what do you actually take from a story like this? It is not really a story about peace breaking out, because peace didn't break out. The war didn't end, or even pause in any meaningful strategic sense. What happened was something smaller and, in a way, harder to explain. For about 48 hours, tens of thousands of ordinary men on both sides of an industrial war looked at each other and, briefly, refused to see an enemy. Not because a general ordered it, precisely because no one did. It has become one of the most retold moments of the entire war. Not because it changed anything about how the war was fought, but because of what it revealed underneath the fighting, that the machinery of the war ran on obedience and distance, and for one Christmas, in patches up and down a 500-mile line of mud and wire, both of those things briefly failed. The guns started again on the 26th of December, in most places right on schedule. But for one night in the coldest, most miserable place in Europe, men who had been sent there to kill each other sang the same carol in 2 different languages. And somehow both understood every word of it.